The world aims to rebuild from the coronavirus pandemic, and it's clear that as they do so, there will be a wall of ideology dividing free and open societies from illiberal states. Over the last few months, the United States under President Joe Biden has been rounding up an alliance of democratic countries to defend against autocratic forces, particularly amid Washington's strategic competition with China. But democracies have been on the downturn for more than a decade as their fundamental pillars have been shaken by the wave of autocratic leaders, populism, disinformation and illiberal practices. Today we diagnose the health of democracies and whether there is hope of reviving liberty, the rule of law and free and fair elections across the world. And for this, there's no one better to turn to than one of the world's most renowned political scientists and leading authority on democracy, Dr. Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Hello, Dr. Diamond. Thank you so much for joining us from sunny California. How are you today?
I'm fine. It's nice to be with you.
Well, it's lovely to have you on our show. It's an honor. And, well, there are quite a lot of questions about democracy nowadays. There have been a lot of questions over the past year. And, well, especially over the course of this pandemic, some have argued that authoritarian governments have actually handled COVID-19 much better compared to countries like the United Kingdom or the United States. And right now, countries like China and Russia, they're actually dishing out their vaccines to developing nations and rolling out monetary support as well. So would you say that at this point, autocracies have the upper hand in terms of their global appeal and influence compared to democracies?
Well, I'd say there's a contest going on for influence, a contest between political systems, if not ideologies, certainly a battle for democracy and freedom in the world. I think that China did poorly in allowing the virus to escape from Wuhan. I mean, we have to begin with that acknowledgement that we wouldn't have a global pandemic if China had been a more open society and had, seized upon the first signs of an incipient epidemic in Wuhan. After that, it did do a very comprehensive job of containing the virus, but only after it escaped China. Russia has not done a good job. Russia is a public health calamity right now, and Vladimir Putin is trying to suppress the news of that. As for the vaccines, I think the Western vaccines, particularly Pfizer, Moderna, even AstraZeneca, to some extent Johnson & Johnson as well, are greatly outperforming the Chinese and Russian vaccines. And one of the two Chinese vaccines has been notably unsuccessful, particularly against the new Delta variant. So I think it's a mixed picture. The US did very badly under Trump in managing the pandemic. It's doing much better now under President Biden and has made remarkable progress in vaccinating much of its population. Europe is coming on board. So I think it's a contest and a drama that is still very much underway.
So as we saw in the G7 meeting last month, a lot of Western countries, countries in the G7, they have the strong will to bring back democracy and really bolster these free and open values across the world. But, well, you've said that since 2005, there's been this democratic recession throughout the world. And, well, do you think there is now a chance of recovery, particularly through US leadership?
Well, I think there's a chance of recovery, a very good chance, but it's a sobering challenge we face. And I think there is an important role for U.S. leadership. But, recovering democratic momentum in the world and containing the authoritarian drift in the world won't happen unless it's a collective effort among the major democracies of the world. And I would include here not only the transatlantic alliance, but the Trans-Pacific alliance of democracies, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, India, and so on. It's got to be a collective effort. President Biden, who we see here, has dedicated himself to convening a summit of democracies late this year or early next. I think that will help. He clearly means with the leadership team he has of Secretary of State Blinken, the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and our Agency for International Development head Samantha Power, to push democratic development in the world again and stand up for democratic institutions and values. But it's got to be a team effort among the democracies of the world.
And well, the US has played a big role in really bolstering democratic values and institutions throughout modern history, and well, it's defended the value of democracy around the world, particularly with its military presence as well as its diplomatic presence. But nowadays, American citizens prefer Uncle Sam to really stay at home and focus on more of the domestic issues. And recently, American troops, they've started. Well, many of them, most of them, have left Afghanistan, despite many concerns of a Taliban takeover and their repressive rule that would likely follow. And also there's the Burmese, there's the question of Myanmar, the people being caught in quite a quagmire. So all these democratic issues, to what extent do you think the US is committed right now to strengthening democracies abroad? And do you think it can do so, really support the process without as much overseas presence?
Well, we have to separate out military from political and institution building presence and from development assistance presence. What the American people are saying is they've had enough of committing American military troops to wars without end that seem to have a nation-building purpose that isn't proving successful. I think I would have stayed in Afghanistan longer to try to hold off the Taliban. I believe we're going to see a slaughter when the Taliban takes control of Afghanistan, and particularly if they take control of Kabul. But you know, this is the will of the American people, no doubt, that the U.S. end its what's been called the forever war in Afghanistan. It has been 20 years now, and there's been tremendous corruption of the Afghan forces that have kept them from being an effective fighting force, with echoes, of course, of the U.S. misadventure in Vietnam. But I do want to make a distinction between the American public's exhaustion with this type of military engagement and two other things. One is peaceful efforts to support democratic civic groups, civil society, and institutions abroad. Public opinion surveys in the United States show that when you ask the American people if they would support peaceful efforts to partner with other countries to develop democratic institutions and values, they overwhelmingly support that. And the second thing is, when it comes to national security and pushing back against aggression, Americans feel very differently and much more supportive about the projection of military power abroad. And I think Americans are supportive of using our military strength to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific region, and to make clear to the People's Republic of China that they can't just gobble up and dominate the South China Sea or the East China Sea or you know, the air and maritime space around Taiwan, that there's going to be pushback in defense of freedom.
And you've yourself noted in the past that enforcing democracy by force, it rarely works on autocratic leaders, and you really have to focus on strengthening governance and the pillars of democracy. And while in the past, the West has also attempted to nudge countries into becoming more democratic, especially through economic integration and free market values, particularly when it comes to China. But you've always said that governance reform is probably the most important aspect. So given that the economic experiment until now has failed in China, what would your advice be to the US and Western nations now as they try to compete and also confront with China at the same time, as well as cooperate with them on some issues?
Well, the most important piece of advice I would have is to make the kind of distinction you began to do at the end of your question, that there are some issues on which we have to compete, others where we confront, and others like climate change where, my God, the fate of the planet is at stake. We should try and cooperate. And so here I applaud the Biden administration for trying to draw these distinctions. But I would also say we need to make clear to the Chinese people, particularly Chinese young people in the United States and elsewhere, that we want to embrace them. We want to cooperate with them. We welcome them to study here. And our beef is not with the people of China. Our beef is with their government. Our competition is with their authoritarian political system that's trying to dominate the world and suppress freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and freedom to organize within the People's Republic of China. And if we don't make that distinction and just lump the Chinese people with the Chinese Communist Party state, we're going to provoke an awful eruption of Chinese nationalism that won't do anybody in the world any good. It won't serve peace, it won't serve freedom in China, and it won't serve American national security.
And going forward, what new or creative ways do you expect countries like China and Russia to really try and undermine the US's efforts to build back better, and especially in a democratic way?
Well, they have very different approaches. As you know, Russia has been using its cyber capabilities to try not only to affect the American election, but more importantly to stir dissension, conflict, suspicion, rumors, and lack of faith in democracy. They're trying to feed political polarization, fear, and mutual hatred. They want to weaken American and European societies and democracies in general. China's a bit more subtle in its approach. It has the global voice of China now that is trying to trash democracy and promote the superiority of the Chinese system. But it's using more subtle methods to try to what we call project sharp power, penetrate democracies around the world, not only the United States, but Australia, New Zealand, obviously Taiwan, Europe, Japan, and so on, and build united front relationships that pull people away from their own countries into a subtle alliance with China. So we need to be vigilant against these united front tactics of the Chinese Communist Party state to penetrate democracies around the world, divide them, censor dialogue and debate within our democracies, and intimidate Chinese citizens, both Chinese students and overseas Chinese citizens in our democracies. We can't allow that to happen. It degrades the quality of our own democracy.
Well, nowadays it seems that in addition to these foreign powers, big corporations and big tech, they seem to be really playing a They seem to be playing a growing role in keeping democracy healthy, really. They're controlling the information flow, personal information, the stream of news media, as we saw happen with Facebook in Australia. What do you make of this kind of phenomenon? And do you think big tech companies can be held accountable for being gatekeepers of democracy?
Well, there's a lot of people in American society and European society, I hope in Asian societies as well, that are working to try and hold the big tech companies, both from the United States, but of course now increasingly we have Chinese big tech players that are, of course, heavily controlled by the Chinese state, who are becoming more influential in cyberspace. And I think we need to coordinate our policies to defend and secure individual privacy, to demand more transparency from the big tech companies, and probably even to break up some of these monopolies. I think the effort of Facebook to have an independent oversight board make some decisions about vetting information and possibly kicking people off Facebook and purging some content so it's not the company alone making these decisions is a positive step forward. I know the Facebook Oversight Board has been criticized as just window dressing or an effort to deflect attention, but I do think it's a promising type of initiative.
Well, now before we go, South Korea obviously seen quite an interesting process of democratization over the last few decades after the Korean War, and it broke away from military rule in the late 20th century, of course. Now, with this example of democratization, and with the country set to hold its presidential election, its new presidential election next year, how do you hope to see South Korea continue in its progress in democracy?
Well, first of all, of course, I hope for a vigorously contested but democratically respectful, free and fair election in South Korea. We've got a lot of problems now, even just running credible elections in the United States. We did an excellent job in 2020, but the problem is in the information sphere and in the conspiracies and rumors and falsehoods that people cling on to. So I hope South Korea can continue to transcend that. I do think that President Moon's administration kind of ran roughshod over some democratic norms and principles in its handling of prosecutions, the judiciary, information, and so on. So I hope the next president, whatever party he or she may be from, will restore a balance of accountability and restraint and judicial independence in Korea. And we need, in order to preserve healthy democracies, mutual respect between contending parties, faith in the process, and autonomy for democratic institutions. Otherwise, elected executives, whether presidents or prime ministers, have too easy a path toward the abuse of power and the descent into the populist aggrandizement of power. And of course, that's a danger for democracy.
So hopefully we'll see the three pillars of democracy that you always mentioned being strengthened rather than weakened, as some may have seen in the past. And well, this is where we must wrap up the interview, but thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Diamond. It was a true honor to have you on our show. That was Dr. Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Again, thank you so much for your time.
A pleasure being with you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.